spend some time then talking about this framework of hope that I'm working on, that I would be really interested to hear how it connects with some of your own work around hope with your congregations and despair. And my overarching theory is basically that hope has to be formed like faith, and it has to be tended like love. We do a lot in our churches around faith formation, helping people to form their faith life, practices, etc. And we often just talk about hope as if it is something we either have or don't have. So this is an orientation toward hope that is not about sort of an inner possession, but about practicing hope and cultivating the practice of hope with communities. So I think a lot of times having and not having hope produces shame for people who just cannot come up with the hope that they think that they should have because of their faith or whatever. But I think if we reframe it from that sort of inner possession of having or not having, that forming and cultivating and tending and producing hope turns us toward one another in community in ways that we can practice something together that orients us in a hopeful direction. So that's just sort of the overarching theory of this little framework. And it's almost like, we have catechisms and curriculum for faith formation. Why don't we have something like that for hope? Something that we can come around and cultivate together. And I also want to really distinguish what I'm talking about here with regard to hope from ideas of wishful thinking, believing that it will just all work out in the end, or captivity to ideologies of progress, this notion that we're all constantly induced into that things are getting better all the time, when we know that is not the case. And of course, there are also all sorts of weird escapist ways that we preach and teach hope in the Christian tradition that divorces us from the realities that we have in the world together. So I want to frame hope as a communal practice, not an individual disposition, and also to set that within the context of communities. And if you're here last night, you heard me talk about how community is not just about human community, but it's about our community with the wider web of life as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this first little section here, but if you want a little, email you this PDF of a chapter. But I start with this because I think hope is most pressing. It is the thing that we most need to focus on when we're in periods or positions of despair or hopelessness. And a lot of that, I think, comes out of what I've been talking about lately as the apocalyptic emotions of fear and sadness and anger. And, there are a lot of things pushing people's fear, sadness, and anger buttons right now in our life in the world for really, really legitimate reasons. And each of these emotions comes with a message that we really need to hear. Fear is inviting us to pay attention to the ways that our well-being or the well-being of our wider world of concerns being put into peril, threatened. Anger invites us to really listen to the ways that we're seeing our values of justice, survival, well-being, etc., threatened by things in our life in the world. And sadness invites us to really lean into this question about what is it that we are losing that is provoking this signal of sadness in us. All of these emotions are good emotions because they help us to know something about our experience in our life in the world. But the really harmful part is when we aren't able to listen to these emotions in communities, because if we have no outlet, no compassionate sort of holding a community to express these emotions, then any of these can elongate into longer kind of dispositions or orientations toward life. So the signal of the emotion itself tells us something really important about what's going on in the world. But when we don't pay attention to that and have caring companions to hold that with us, then anger can result in long-term dispositions of resentment, vengefulness, cynicism, polarization. Fear can elongate into helplessness, immobilization, isolation, apathy. Sadness can elongate into despair, numbness, fatigue, loss of meaning. So the first part of the practice of hope, I think, is sort of cultivating the structures to hold these apocalyptic emotions that arise when we feel like something about our world is in peril. We do that in communal context, but we also do that in our sermons, in the ways we preach about things like fear and sadness and anger, in the ways that we can acknowledge openly that these things are things that we are experiencing in our life in the world. And I encounter churches and pastors and students who are part of churches all the time who say, in my church, it is just off limits to talk about the fearfulness in our life in the world right now, because people have different perspectives on the things that are causing this fear, so we just can't talk about it. And that is a recipe for despair among people who are coming to a community that purports to be a caring community that can hold, within an ultimate context, theological context, our life in the world, but who refuses to talk about many of the things that are most pressing in our life right now. So, if you want the article on tending these emotions, just email me and I will send you that PDF. But I want to move on a little bit to the practice of hope in this sort of hope wheel that's developing here. So out of this fear, sadness, and anger, this is also in the PDF too, I'll be glad to send you. Cultivating more complex emotions of gratitude, wonder, and grief. Helps us to hold those experiences of fear, sadness, and anger. Fear, sadness, and anger are all emotions that most psychologists, Western psychologists, think of as primary emotions. There's sort of a deep evolutionary emotions that we come with that send signals to us our survival. Gratitude, grief, and wonder are more complex emotions. They're the emotions that develop, I think, in more communal contexts, when we can think together, talk together, celebrate together the things that feel like gifts in our life in the world, even when it feels like a lot of our world is coming to an end, and how these gifts are moving us toward giving toward others. Grief, holding together in community the losses that we're experiencing, really intentionally mourning, drawing on the rich heritage of lament within our Christian tradition, and sharing that work of grief with others, and wonder what is evoking our sense of awe, of mystery, of curiosity together that moves us out of our sense of self and toward others in the larger community. One of the really amazing things about wonder psychologically is that wonder tends to orient us outward toward other people and the wider web of life too. So anything that you can do to cultivate wonder with your communities is moving toward hope in my mind. And while Western psychologists don't think of wonder as a primary emotion, there's some really amazing kind of treatments of emotions in other traditions, ancient traditions. Like there's a 3rd century Sanskrit text that names wonder as one of the primary emotions in that kind of mindset. And it describes wonder as seeing divinely. And I love that notion. And I think we typically undervalue the gift of our Christian tradition that moves us toward wonder. I think a lot of our liturgical tradition has been cultivating that sense of wonder, opening up toward something that is larger, something that is beyond us. When you read the Psalms, the ways that the psalmist invokes the praise of the celestial bodies, the trees, the bodies of water, the animals, etc., alongside humanity. Those are psalms of genuine wonder. So I just, want to encourage you to think about what in your ministry is helping people to turn toward wonder, even in times that feel really despairing.
What's that Sanskrit?
This is a 3rd century Sanskrit text that named wonder as seeing divinely. There's also some really great stuff in like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He talks about he talks about it with the language of radical amazement. Heschel's a good source to go to think about wonder. All this stuff, including that Sanskrit text, is in the article that I'll send you if you'll email me. All right, moving on a little bit from these, I want to think about how we do the work of mobilizing our hopefulness. And I have just sort of this 6 sort of, spiral of components here that I just want to walk through each one of them and tell you a little story that illustrates each one of these things. Does that sound okay? A couple of the stories are stories you heard last night, but only maybe 4 of you were here last night, so they'll be new for most of you. And just to be clear, there's no like linear notion of this of these steps. It's not a linear progress through 1 through 6. It's just part. You can start anywhere on this wheel in your practices of ministry. But I'll start here with the realistic appraisal. I think this is a really important part of practicing hope with a community, and that is just keeping your eyes open. Looking at the world as it is and not as you wish it would be. Putting the pieces together, taking in helpful, critical, long-form commentary. I think one of the things that's really harming us right now is that we've taken such short bits, tiny bits of information, oftentimes not even accurate information in the forms of like social media memes that look like news. And we don't really have an accurate understanding of what is happening in our lives in the world. So forming this accurate, realistic appraisal is basically just refusing to look away from what's happening in the world right now. And I want to say, like, there's a way that we can fall into fatalism in both positive and optimistic and pessimistic ways. Optimistic fatalism says, don't worry, everything's going to work out. That's still fatalism. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to worry about. It's all going to work out in the end. I think that's the fatalism that many of our community members probably sometimes wishfully lean into. The pessimistic variety is we're doomed and there's nothing we can do about it. A lot of people that I know are moving into that more fatalism right now. So there are a lot of things that hinder us from realistic appraisals of the situations we're in, especially in Christian communities. I interviewed a pastor once who told me this. She was very recently, and I was really impacted by these words of hers. She said, I never used to worry about standing up in front and preaching. I've been doing it since I was 16 or 17 years old. It never used to scare me. In the last 10 years or so, it makes me nervous to do it. To get up there and to be vulnerable and open with what I think and my beliefs and all of this stuff, and not worry about losing every person in my congregation or worse. So one of the things that does hinder us from helping people develop a realistic appraisal is the fear that many pastors and lay people have when they come to church to even say what is happening in our life in the world right now. And lay people I hear talk about all the time the concerns of polarization among their friend groups. So they just don't talk about things that they think will be divisive. We also often, I think, fear discouraging others by helping them develop a realistic appraisal of what's happening in our life in the world. And here's a piece that I think is really important, at least in my conception of hope here. I don't see despair as the antithesis of hope. I actually see despair as one of the preconditions of practicing hope. I don't really find hope a meaningful thing when everything is going well. What hope do we need in that situation? Hope comes into active presence in our practice of faith when things are really dire. But we often want to care for people by not talking about hard things, even though they're already aware of them and they're thinking about them and they're talking about them with whomever they can get to talk about them with. And then the third factor, I think, is this all-out assault on the information that we have available to us at any given time. Just misinformation, intentional disinformation, AI hallucinations that make up information, deep fakes that are increasingly, I see all the time now, people posting stories on social media that are clearly made up with a photograph that is clearly AI. And oftentimes these are positive stories, like really inspiring, hopeful stories, but totally untrue. And just they don't see that in what they're sharing. So this also hinders us from being able to develop a realist appraisal of what's happening in our life in the world. And then, I think for a lot of people, the liberal tendency to get caught up in a never-ending cycle of critique, of diagnosing the problem, but never really moving beyond diagnosis is a hindrance. I just put this book up here because I think this is a really, really interesting treatment of the ways that many of our current issues we face politically, economically, etc., how they are kind of traced back through the Christian theological tradition. In some ways, it's a really easy to read book. It's not, I don't know, you might have a group of lay people who would want to get around this book and talk about it, but it's definitely what I think you would appreciate. All right, a little vignette before we move on. I'm going to read this because I want to get the details correct. Political scientist, this is from Katie Cronin Furman, who wrote in the New York Times a few years ago about what she called the mass atrocity of the U.S.-Mexico border. And of course, we know that this is even worse now than it was a few years ago. And it's not at the border, it's down the street. And she tells this story of an earlier period of mass atrocity that she hopes communities can learn from today. It says in Denmark during World War II, strong social pressure, including from the churches, contributed to the refusal of the country to comply with Nazi orders to deport its Jewish citizens. And it was not pressure on the politicians at the top. She says it was pressure on the foot soldiers and the bureaucratic middlemen who experienced the social pressure of their neighbors to stop participating in the work that they were undertaking. Not as a matter of strong ideology, but as their just 9-to-5 job. This just happens to be what they were doing. So when the Nazis revealed their plan to deport the entire Jewish population from Denmark, that was read from every pulpit in the entire country on October 3rd, 1943, and it read in part, wherever Jews are persecuted because of their religion or race, it is the duty of the Christian church to protest against such persecution, because it is in conflict with the sense of justice inherent in the Danish people and inseparable from our Danish Christian culture through the centuries. We understand religious freedom as the right to exercise our worship of God as our vocation and conscience bids us, and in such a manner that race and religion per se can never justify that a person be deprived of his rights, freedom, or property. Our different religious views notwithstanding, we shall fight for the cause that our Jewish brothers and sisters may preserve the same freedom which we ourselves evaluate more highly than life itself. Every Danish pulpit, this letter was read on this particular day. Then they collaborated together to hide their Jewish neighbors until they could be evacuated to Sweden. So this was organized by hundreds of private citizens working together to collect funds for their efforts. And on the night of the rescue effort, all German patrol ships in the area were docked for repairs because the Danes bribed the Nazi soldiers to dock the ships so that they could make their escape. And they made their escape with their Jewish neighbors on fishing boats. But the fishermen were often so poor that they couldn't afford to lose a day's wage. So the Danes raised money to give the fishermen a day's wage to use their boats to help their neighbors escape. And in the end, the Nazis were only successful in deporting 580 of Denmark's 7,000 Jews. I think this is the kind of story churches need to have circulating in their collective consciousness. The ways that we have come together in periods of time in the past to rescue our neighbors who were in peril. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't an effort to change the minds of the people at the top. It was, working to just, what does the phrase that Luther used? Put a spoke in the, what? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, Bonhoeffer put a spoke in the wheel of injustice or something like that. And they rescued the vast majority of their Jewish neighbors. But they didn't wait until the situation got so bad that it was almost too late to start acting. They were realistic in their appraisal of a dire situation. And they acted before it was too late and saved their neighbors' lives. And I think this is a really helpful story to illustrate that part of the wheel, the realistic appraisal part. It also moves us into the courage to risk piece. And this is, about helping people to move toward the pain in the world rather than away from it. And I think a lot of our congregations might think of themselves as courageous, but moving into acts of courage that risk something, I think, is the piece that is often missing for us. So I would ask you, in your congregations and your communities, what are the stories of your congregation risking something of its own life in order to stand in solidarity with people whose backs are against the wall? I imagine some of your congregations have these stories that just aren't necessarily circulating right now. And this is the time when those stories need to be told as inspiration for us, that these stories live within our DNA. And if it's not in your specific congregation, it is in your tradition. Whether that's Lutheran tradition or Baptist tradition, we have these stories in our lives, in our living traditions that we need to draw on right now. This is a story I told last night, but I'll tell it again for those who weren't here because it's a really inspiring one. I'll tell some more details though that I didn't tell last night. In 1986, my friend Jim Matulski, who's in the middle there in the stole, spent 10 years as the pastor of the predominantly LGBTQ MCC Church of San Francisco in the Castro. And throughout those years, his church became the de facto community center. In fact, I recently learned that San Francisco didn't have an LGBTQ community center until 2002. So his church was literally the de facto community center because there wasn't one. He said it was a protest every Friday night, which turned into a dance party. And the church was growing and dying all at the same time. They had to add a second and third service every week. They were growing so quickly, but they were also having multiple funerals every week. About half of the city's 60,000 gay men had AIDS, and there was no effective treatment in these early years. Jim said they were dying and in great pain, and in some instances barely able to talk. Each and every person I talked to was convinced they had brought this on themselves. They were worried about going to hell. Many of them were experiencing rejection from friends, from family, from loved ones. And many of them became untouchable in their own communities, literally. Everyone from family members to medical professionals to funeral directors would not touch a man who had HIV or AIDS. So the MCC, Metropolitan Community Church, intervened liturgically in that situation. And every Sunday, when people approached the altar for communion, after they were served the elements of communion, they would go to the next person over, and with non-intrusive touch, saying the person's name when possible, they would be offered a blessing. And it may have been the one time in the week that someone was willing to touch their body, and it happened at communion in their church. Jim says it was an act of revolution as well as resistance, as everyone at the communion table, both the ministers and the parishioners, were excluded from the sacrament in other churches. He said, quote, "We were seizing communion back from our oppressors." And he tells the story of one man he would visit in the hospital in his dying days who said, "Will you hold my hand and pray with me?" Which of course I did, Jim said. And he said that the only person who would hold his hand and pray with him was one of the nurses on the night shift, who always prayed that he would be delivered of his sin of homosexuality before he died. Jim says by the time anyone realized AIDS was sexually transmitted and damage was widespread, the disease could strike a fit, healthy young guy, and he'd be dead in months. He said our mood became darker, our hope dissipated, and I became kind of nihilistic. We felt like our world was dying, and it was impossible to communicate to people who weren't there. So at the time, the only treatment for HIV was 36 pills a day, which made people really sick. Lots of nausea, and the only thing that helped was marijuana to keep the nausea down, to allow the men to eat a little bit. But almost overnight, all of the buyers clubs were shut down by the attorney general, who was hopeful to become the next governor. And Jim was conflicted about what to do in that situation, and whether the church should begin distributing marijuana to these men who were dying of AIDS. And he contacted a woman named Phyllis Nelson, who's a member of the church. Her son Glenn and partner Rob had both died of AIDS. And Phyllis said, "Of course we'll pass out marijuana, and I'll stand right next to you." Jim said that this was after his own HIV diagnosis, and he said there was a change in me facing my own mortality, and it made me realize we're only here as long as we're here. What are you being so cautious about? My ministry changed right after that. So in 1996, they began to give out pot to AIDS patients at the church right after communion and before the closing hymn. And they had rules: no money could be exchanged, the pot had to be donated, people had to provide a doctor's note. And the city said that they would try to protect them as much as possible from federal prosecution, but they couldn't guarantee it. And this is what Jim said at the end of the story. "I took a risk, I used my body, I acted on a belief that was motivated by my desire to provoke healing and comfort for my friends. And I didn't know what else I could do. But this was something that I could do, and I did it. And the risks were real, and they were real." And he said, "Let your acts of love guide you, even if, and you will never regret acts of great love." So I think that is a story of a church literally working to provide care, comfort, dignity, support in the last weeks of life for, over the course of time, hundreds and hundreds of their parishioners. Jim said about 1,000 funerals in that decade. So I think that's a really good illustration of courage to risk. The next piece of this is developing an anticipatory view. And this is just about nurturing our imaginations and the imaginations of your congregation for possibilities that are other than the current status quo. When hope becomes less possible is when we imagine that the way things are is the way that they always will be or have to be. Transgender sci-fi writer Charlie Jane Anders says, visualizing a happier, more just world is a direct assault on the forces that are trying to break your heart. I love that phrase.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. One more time. Yeah, one more time.
Visualizing a happier, more just world is a direct assault on the forces that are trying to break your heart. We can say something about
Yeah, so I'm going through a process with backstory preaching, and they have a certain formula for their preaching, and one of their pieces is the invitation to transformation. And so that sounds very much like, how are you casting the vision for something better? What is God's world, and how are we invited into that? And so that's exactly that.
And that's why this realistic appraisal piece of things is really dangerous if it's not also paired with.
Yes.
If it's not also paired with an anticipatory view of how things could be otherwise.
Exactly.
And this courage to risk, I think, is the bridge between those things. Because if all we have is the realistic appraisal and anticipatory view, then what we have is wishful thinking. The courage to risk sort of moves us in action toward that new future, and it's the sort of animating drive toward that anticipatory view. And this is also sort of the not yet nature of the eschatological imagination.
Exactly.
Good Lutheran theologian, Ernst Käsemann, who is, I think, one of the people we should be reading right now. Not his New Testament scholarship necessarily, but his writings about his involvement in the confessing church. Do you know this about Käsemann? Käsemann voted for Hitler, and then almost immediately realized what a mistake that had been. And then he joined Bonhoeffer and then others. The difference is, Käsemann, though he was imprisoned at one point, he wasn't martyred. So he lived another 4 or 5 decades reflecting back on that period of time in some really incredible essays and speeches. One of the collections is called Church Conflicts. It was translated by Luther professor Roy Harrisville, who was a New Testament professor. And another collection of those essays and speeches is called Becoming a Disciple of the Crucified Nazarene, I believe. Both of those collections are just powerful to read right now. And Käsemann, the reason I brought him up, is that he says, apocalyptic is the mother of all theology. I think the theology begins with this notion of an anticipatory view toward an otherwise possibility from the status quo. A little vignette about this one. I told you this a little bit last night, not in full. Troy Perry here was a Pentecostal minister who was really despairing over this conflict between what he perceived as a conflict between his sexuality and faith. And eventually he came to this resolution that he needed to be putting these two things together rather than trying to keep them apart. And so he put an ad in the Advocate magazine for a worship service in his living room. And he just invited anyone in LA who wanted to come to his living room on this day, October 6, 1968, to come. And 12 people came. And he thought, I said this last night, he thought that this would be sort of a temporary stopgap measure in order to have a place of belonging for LGBTQ people for a couple of years while all the mainline denominations came around to inclusion on LGBTQ concerns. Yeah, very hopeful in 1968. Obviously that did not happen. And the MCC Church grew as the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history. First building ever owned by any gay organization was the sanctuary of the MCC Church in LA. I think this is a really good example of what an anticipatory view looks like. The status quo was LGBTQ exclusion, second-class citizenship in churches, et cetera, et cetera. And Perry and this little group of people in this living room had a vision of a church where LGBTQ people belonged, could serve in ministry, etc. And before there were other examples to really look to for that, they were moving in that direction because of this anticipatory view that they had in 1968. I think remarkable. So these are the kinds of stories I think we need right now in our churches too, because they belong to us, and they're the church that inspire us toward this kind of anticipatory, hopeful view. And the next piece of this is community. I'm trying to go through this a little quickly so that we can have a little time to discuss it. This one should be pretty obvious to you. I don't think that it's possible to necessarily practice hope alone. I think it requires us to be in community with one another to do these kinds of things. Really amazing story here I want to share from a book that I also would recommend called Hope for Cynics, written by a neuroscientist, Jamil Zaki from Stanford. In that book, he talks about two neighborhoods in Kobe, Japan, called Mano and Makura. They were just about 3 miles apart from each other, both dense with factories, workshops, houses, both aging middle and working class populations. But there are a couple of differences between these neighborhoods. Mano was full of small businesses. Oh, thank you very much. Full of small businesses relying on trade between neighbors. Women played an integral role in the economy in Mano, whereas Makura was more patriarchal. Mano had a history of facing challenges together. When factories were poisoning the air, 40% of the residents were suffering asthma. Public services like garbage collection lapsed. The neighborhood of Mano came together to form a local planning committee, pressure the government for resources, anti-pollution efforts, et cetera, and really changed the ecological environment there. The neighborhood of Makura had never had this history of hardship and banding together. So in '95, there was a massive earthquake in Kobe, Japan. Fires erupted all over the city. The surrounding areas lasted 2 days, killed over 5,000 people, destroyed more than 100,000 buildings. And here's where the history of these two neighborhoods, 3 miles apart, comes into play. Zaki says, Makurans watched many in their night clothes while homes turned to ash. Mano residents didn't wait for the authorities, but leapt into action together, forming pop-up bucket brigades, grabbing hoses from factories, pumping water from rivers to fight the fire. About 1 in every 4 homes in Mano was ruined, but almost 3 out of every 4 homes were destroyed in Makura. And Makura's death rate was 10 times higher than Mano. Then afterwards, Mano formed relief organizations, collected signatures to build temporary houses, set up makeshift daycares, and Makura didn't coordinate any of their actions and lost out on a lot of public services. So he tells these stories because this history of Mano as a neighborhood that had banded together for decades to fight for their community then came immediately into play in the aftermath of this disaster. Makura, just 3 miles down the road, almost identical as a neighborhood, had no history of coming together as a community. And then when disaster struck, their death toll and destruction rates were so much higher because they didn't have the kind of muscle memory of how to do something together as a community. This is where I think churches have a real gift to offer to communities. We know how to bring people together to do important things. I'm going to skip over a few things here for time. We talked about this last night. And move this morning and lament piece. I think to love the world right now means that we have to mourn the world right now. Not just the kind of human atrocities that are taking place, but the ecological devastation that's taking place around us right now. And enacting our mourning and lament in community resists this drive toward optimism and progress. It allows us to really see what is being lost and to come together in our grief over that loss, to mourn it. The vignette I was going to share is one that probably you know pretty well. This is not the vignette, but you know, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, the community gathered there. Do you know this part of the story? The community gathered around him, his body, while it laid on the asphalt for hours, and his community stayed with the body. Then pastoral theologian Shanika Walker Barnes describes this impromptu vigil that developed in the streets of Ferguson that day. She said, quietly, they watched as the coroner's van showed up at the scene. Then when Michael's body had been loaded onto the coroner's van, they followed, walking en masse to the police department. There too, they waited calmly for someone to come out and explain why Brown had been shot, when, as the word had already spread, his hands had been up. And she describes this as an historic African-American mourning ritual of staying with the body. And of course, the police took their presence as a sign of danger, instituted a curfew, etc. But this way that the community, in an impromptu way, came together to not look away at the loss that was happening and to mourn it, really reflects this long history, I think, of African-American mourning ritual. Going back, of course, to Mamie Till Mobley, when her son Emmett Till was killed, and the funeral director nearly just insisted that they have a closed casket because his body was so horribly disfigured. And she insisted that the casket be open so that people could see what they had done to her son. This is the illustration of the importance of mourning as a part of hopefulness. If we aren't mourning, I think we don't have the emotional elasticity there. I was going to tell this story, gathering of basically a funeral ritual for the very first glacier that completely and entirely went away in Iceland. And they put this plaque up here to mark this occasion. And they say this monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and we know what needs to be done. Only you will know if we did it. Mourning the ecological web of life, I think, is a really important one too right now. This is a way that we did this at my church in Cambridge. This was about a 7-foot wooden cross that we put out on the front lawn in 2018. And every time there was a mass shooting in the country, we stamped the city, the state, and the number dead on one of these metal tags and nailed it to the cross. So over the course of the year, it started with just a couple of tags in the middle and then grew out in every direction and on the sides. And by the end of the year, there were 360 some mass shootings that were cataloged on this cross. There was a sign beneath it explaining to people what it was. A visible sign of mourning the atrocities of mass shootings. And we did the same kind of public witness with the children who died in ICE detention during the first Trump administration. Okay, finally, caring praxis. This is sort of how we institute the care that our communities need that move toward hopeful action. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because I need to be sure we have a little bit of time for questions. And I was going to tell the story to illustrate it of the Black Panthers Free Breakfast for Children program, which I told last night. So I'll tell a briefer version of it now. This was in a period of time when children were going to school hungry and unable to learn. And the Black Panthers in Oakland, their very, very first program in 1968 was the Free Breakfast for Children program, where they partnered with a church and a pastor, St. Augustine's Church in Oakland, and a bunch of neighborhood mothers who started feeding children. And by the end of the year, they were feeding 20,000 children in about 23 cities. More children than the state of California was feeding. And J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI at the time, called them the greatest internal threat to the security of the country because of this program, and tried to destroy it, forged letters to the stores that were donating food to discourage them from doing that, spread rumors that the food was poisoned, that even raided the food program sites as the children ate. And in the end, they were not successful in destroying this program. In fact, the Panthers were so successful at this that eventually the government increased funding for school children and started to feed children in the schools because they couldn't destroy the Panthers program. And I love that story. It's a story of mutual aid and caring and practice for community that was experiencing the organized abandonment of those children. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to stop here so that we have time to discuss a little bit about what you heard in this 45 minutes. What would you like to land on for a little while to flesh out a little more, especially as it pertains to your own contexts and communities? Or any questions or comments about whether this is helpful or not in terms of how to help your congregations think about practicing hope and not just having or not having hope.
We have a Bible study. Some of us are for Trump, some of us are not. And we're very strong in our feelings. But we respect each other in all the other ways that we talk about. We cannot talk about that. Yeah, I mean, I just, like, I thought, well, I'd like to ask one of them, well, what's he doing that you like? You know, in my opinion, you know. So in other words, we're not even talking.
Yeah. Others have thoughts about this or ways that you experience this in your context?
Couldn't hear what she said.
Hmm?
I didn't
She
hear what
said
she
that
said.
some people are for Trump and some are against Bible study. And that people feel very strongly, and so you can't talk about that. So I think the question is, what do you do with that?
Yes, that's very good.
Yeah.
And that's because I think it's a larger concern, you know.
You have to respect, well, things have gotten so polarized, which of course you have addressed. And that in order to have a Bible study, I mean, we have a goal. And if you get all involved in politics, then you don't have time to do what you're there for, what other people have come for.
Yeah.
So as far as taking action and being a realistic approach and all those wonderful things that you just presented, we default to just trying to stay away from that.
So here's a sort of a follow-up question. I wonder if that might be helpful. I've had some pastoral care conversations about this, and what came out of it was we need to do some kind of conversation about differences and start somewhere and sort of find ways to talk about it and to bring it together, but in a safe manner. So that's a kind of how, what might you have resources wise for that kind of.
A really, really helpful book that I would recommend for just the practical nature of having those kinds of conversations is a book called I've Never Thought of It That Way Before.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember the name of the author. She's a Latina journalist, self-described as a liberal. Her parents are first-generation immigrants who are Trump supporters.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed to figure out how to talk about their differences in order for them to be able to have a relationship together. So the book is just basically all about how she's developed conversational skills to understand across differences, you know, not to come to some sort of middle road compromise on things or whatever, but just to understand someone who is on the other side of a political divide. I think it's a really practical book.
That's great.
It was the Luther summer book read 2 summers ago. The whole seminary community was invited to read it. And then we had, Monica Guzman, that's her name. We had her come via Zoom and talk to us.
Awesome.
It's a really terrific book.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the books on these kind of political divides are more diagnostic, but this one is more just kind of practically oriented in terms of how to have conversations with others.
Yeah, that's great.
This seems to connect to something that you shared more about last night, which was those sort of 3 concentric circles and sort of belonging at the middle to those closest to us, friends and loved ones, affinity groups at the outside. We learn love, we learn loyalty, but that middle group where we learn tolerance.
Yeah.
And that was a particularly striking portion of last night's lecture that members of my church who came last night were talking about afterwards, and something that they were noticing. They felt like it was becoming harder for the church to be a place where tolerance could be practiced. And so I think I'm just in light of this morning's conversation wondering about the relationship between hope and tolerance. And,
So I can just say it, Church of the Holy Spirit, so I'm not like technically there, I'm doing my field education somewhere else, but people come to me because I know the parishioners, and they say, well, I'm Democrat, I'm so uncomfortable, we're leaving the church, right? And I'm like, you need to go talk to the clergy, right? And voice your concerns and your opinion. Oh, I don't want to do that, I don't want to bother them. They have said we are not preaching politics from the pulpit, period. I'm like, yeah, but they need to hear from you. So I'm trying to encourage that conversation. It's not going well. And so I was told from the higher ups at the Episcopal Church that if we want to start a conversation, they encourage us to use Braver Angels, that organization, to bring a facilitator in to start the conversation, but nobody wants to start it. Right? It's too. They're afraid it will end badly, and we're in the middle of the capital campaign. So like we can't start that conversation because of our capital campaign. And I'm like, okay, you're gonna keep losing more people, right? And you can't, it's so hard to get people back once they've left, so you need to prevent them from leaving. But, again, here I am a student, like, you should do this differently, but yeah, not get very far. So Braver Angels is supposed to be great.
yeah, I'm aware of them.
Yeah.
They do good work.
Yeah.
This isn't a direct recommendation, this is just in general. You mentioned before, like, you use narrative background for a lot of your work in pastoral care. And the church I came from, we went through a 2-year process on LGBTQ plus inclusion in Liberty, Missouri in 2025. And we had Trump supporters, we had very left-leaning people all over the spectrum. And the goal was make everyone feel heard and make everybody, let everybody be able to share their stories. And that was our most powerful tool, was the stories of people who were from the community, of families who had children who were LGBTQ plus, and just giving people the space to hear the stories and tell their stories and be honest about where they were coming from. Like, that was the most powerful tool that we had. And we went from being non to having a statement of welcome, inclusion, and belonging within those 2 years.
Yeah.
So you didn't have a problem with people being respectful to different viewpoints?
We really didn't, because there had been so much prep work done in the years, like 5-10 years prior, on how can you have those conversations. And I think there's also a bit of a cultural piece in the culture we were in of more let bygones be bygones, like, we're gonna disagree. Let's just move on, kind of that Midwest nice piece to it. But I think we will not
Success. It was successful.
It was successful, and we only had 2 families in the church. But that to me really emphasizes storytelling is one of the most powerful tools that we have.
Guzman's book does a good job describing how to invite story and also how to be curious about another story that really runs contrary to your own story. Yeah, that's really helpful.
There was a way for me that your ending point around lament and grief connected with kind of the beginning point about differentiating between hope and optimism, or the myth of progress. In that I was thinking, it's hard to tolerate the feelings of grief, or it can be. It's hard to tolerate sitting in this physical moment because it requires a kind of truth telling. And if we're not able to agree on what the facts are, what the truths are, then it's hard to get to the lament. And so it just sort of left me, again, wondering kind of what are the preliminary steps, or what are the opening steps if what you're encountering when you try to talk about hope is people immediately shifting that to a conversation about optimism. And how to invite people into a different imaginary space around the difference between hope and optimism, and even maybe the dangers of optimism. Because I think the thing is, it feels almost like a betrayal of Christian faith for some people to say something like, well, I don't feel optimistic, so.
Yeah, which is a really incredible thing to witness when the entirety of our scriptural tradition was written in the context of either exile or post-exile or Roman occupation. Yeah, I mean, part of this has to do with how people have been taught the Christian tradition. Which has just been overlaid with sort of it was like a Christian veneer that's been overlaid on American progress and optimism. That is really hard to break out of for a lot of folks. So, I mean, but I think a lot of the ways that we do this, at least to my mind, is in how we preach and teach and study the gospel together. How you read the gospels and don't come away siding with the marginalized, the oppressed, the vulnerable, is a mystery to me, and is heresy. But we don't teach that typically, or preach that as forcefully. But yeah, I really don't know how we've come to this place in such an intractable way.
But when you opened and you said it's hard for clergy to get in the pulpit, I mean, clergy get in the pulpit and they're girding their loins to read the Beatitudes.
Yes, right.
It's not, okay, I'm gonna get in there and I'm gonna preach some partisan politics. No, your clergy are scared to read the Beatitudes word for word from the gospel text.
Because it's going to be construed as something.
Because how dare you?
It's there.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I love that story of Jim Metelsky going to Penny, what was her name? Penny Nelson. And it was the layperson who said, of course we will do this and I will stand right next to you when we do it. I think too many pastors are just sort of hanging out there over the ledge because there aren't enough lay people who are willing to be in solidarity. And that reading of the gospel that sides with the marginalized, the oppressed, those with their backs against the wall. The quintessential formula of that is the widow, the orphan,
Right.
stranger, the foreigner. Yeah. And we can't overcome a generational mishandling of the Christian tradition in a couple of sermons. And I fully expect it will be a really hard to struggle and one that probably in a lot of ways mirrors things like the confessing church movement in Germany. The German church went for Hitler. The majority of Christians were supporting the Nazi party. I don't know, this is the thing that I think we often, we want to identify with Bonhoeffer and the confessing church, when the reality is
He was
probably.
in jail.
Right, well, that too. But
He was in jail.
But the majority of our churches, if we were in that era, would be the German
Hated him.
church.
Yeah.
Yes, not the confessing church. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the realistic appraisal, the courage to risk, and doing this with community, the anticipatory view, like all those things are kind of dangerous things. And I fully believe that hope is a dangerous thing in two ways. First, it's dangerous to preach poorly and lead people into wishful thinking and optimism and complacency with the status quo.
Right.
But then the other side of it is it's really dangerous to actually practice hope, because it leads us into solidarity with people who are in positions of being targeted for violence. And then we become targets too. Practicing hope is a dangerous thing in the Christian tradition.
Because putting that into practice means, what if I actually go to my neighbors that we talked about when we were leading, and what if I go to how many of the people in our churches have boats in Waukegan Harbor? How many of the people in our churches would actually let undocumented people go fishing up in the boundary waters with them?
I think you're onto something with solidarity and organizing communities together to say, the Danish churches read that all from the pulpit that same day. That feels so powerful, and I just want that,
I had a question about that. Were all Danish churches kind of in the same denomination at that point, or was this like cross-denominational?
I think it was a state church.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that kind of makes you think, like, are we seeing that on the opposite side right now? Where we kind of have this like state church sort of simmering, and
Interesting, yeah.
we're in a very different situation.
Also, to what extent does it even matter?
Good point. Yeah, that's my next question.
There was a resolution raised in the Episcopal Church yesterday that when Bishop Paula Clark issues a statement about where we stand on supporting immigrants, that the resolution, if it passes, states that every church in the diocese must read the statement within 2 weeks of it being issued.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it has to go to vote and,
That's your diocesan bishop?
Yep.
Okay.
yeah. So, and she's, in alignment with the national bishop's view on immigration, so. It's interesting, because that's like that happening today, because then, even if it's not said in the pulpit, if it's said during announcements or something, it's said from pretty close to the altar. So it kind of forces the conversation to be started, especially in churches where they absolutely don't want to start it. So I don't think it'll pass. I pray that.
Interesting.
Excuse me,
Where-
what is that statement? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Yeah, it's in an Episcopal Church, resolution in the Episcopal Church saying that every church will have to read the statement from the bishop on immigration, where we stand on immigration and supporting immigrants.
Oh.
We're a little past time, but if you want, my email address is right here. Listed on the bottom, some of Luther's other offerings that you can access as well. Well, a couple that I would point out to you that would be really interesting for like Bible studies. Enter the Bible. It's a really good biblical study resource written by Bible professors from Luther across the last couple decades. Faith Lead is a place where you can take short classes on various things. There's a mental health, a live webinar with about 30 people on trauma-informed ministry, so you might want to follow Faith Lead. There's also a brand new podcast episode out yesterday where they interviewed me talking about mental health ministry too.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of faith Lead stuff there.
working preacher. Every preacher I know in the world knows who uses working preacher.
Yep.
So anyway, lots of things there that can look
Yeah.
at.
And there's a couple of those resources on the table back there, but thank you so very
Yeah,
much,
thank you.
Dr.
Thank you,
Cody
Sue.
and Christine, for coming. Thank you everyone for joining online, and we will have some follow-ups after this. We've got lots of links and things, so we'll make sure that everybody gets all the good stuff. And thank you so very much for inspiring us to continue in hope.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Yes.
You're such a patient.
Yeah.
Good job. Let's go to the playground.